Sasha and Steve for bringing us over. It's really an honor to present with this group of people.
Cool. Yes, let me echo that. Am I, yeah, okay. Okay, so I'm going to just say a brief introductory word here, which is, as Steve mentioned, Ben and I, we started this website, The Beautiful Brain, in 2009. For me personally, I studied art history and neuroscience in college, and then Ben became interested in neuroscience as well, and we started this site as kind of a way to explore those two subjects in parallel. We didn't really know at first how to bring them together, but a night like this, I think, is exactly the exciting way it can come together. We explore some different aspects of this question. It's nice to share the title with Lach's film of The Beautiful Brain. I think that's already a nice synergy going on. But we talk about neuroaesthetics a little bit on the site, which is this scientific inquiry of what happens when we look at art. And we also do some galleries with brain images and historical inquiries into where some of these parallels first began. So with that, I'm going to introduce Ben, who has been looking into the founder of modern neuroscience, Santiago Ramon y Cajal.
Thanks, Noah. Let's see. When we heard about this event, which had to do with aphasia, which is defined as a disruption in speech production in the brain, we thought about the theme of discontinuity. So I'm going to talk about the discontinuity in the anatomy of the brain and the nervous system. So the nervous system is the biological communication network that every one of us has inside of us, and many organisms have, that evolved to facilitate our survival by helping us essentially find food and avoid poison for long enough time to replicate ourselves. So our ability to react to the environment is coordinated by the nervous system, which evolved in more complex organisms and continue to evolve over hundreds of millions of years. And in most animals, most species of animals, includes the brain, which is this like aggregation of soft tissue inside our heads that sends and receives signals about the internal and external environment, and is responsible for orchestrating this whole mess. So, of course, the brain is responsible for more than our survival. Like we all know, or we believe, that we have an experience of ourselves and consciousness and language and thought and emotion. So it's not just like, like a sea creature where we don't know what they think about. But basically, we have all these higher order abstract capacities. And the reason why I got interested in the brain is I thought about the first line of the Dhammapada, the moral teachings of the Buddha, which is translated as, our life is the creation of our mind. And Western science has discovered that, or we believe that the brain produces the mind, so then the brain is sort of like our existential source material. There's this way in which the structure of the brain, the embedded patterns in the brain, might reflect on our experience of daily life, and that's something I've kind of explored. So with that, I'm going to talk a little about the history of neuroscience. There's this guy in the late 18th century his name was Luigi Galvani, and some people think by accident, sparked the dead legs of a frog, and he watched them twitch. And that's how he discovered what he calls animal electricity, this intrinsic force that circulates or is propagated through the body, sending signals to the muscles to move and throughout the nervous system. So this is a continuous activity. This is something that's always happening. So the question was, how does this happen? How does the system work? And it would be intuitive to assume that a continuous signal would be propagated by a continuous network. And that's what people thought through the 19th century, despite cell theory, which established that all life is composed of cells, and all organisms are made up of cells, like from plants to amoeba, everything. People thought the brain was different because the brain is exceptional, because the brain is the seat of the soul, and the brain produces this experience of the mind and all of this. So all of this is true until this guy called Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who's like my spirit animal, I guess you would say. This is a picture of him in medical school in Zaragoza, just posing, contemplating death. He was a Spanish physician who kept a home laboratory and studied the pressing questions in anatomy and physiology on his own. Back in that time, the practice was histology. Like you would dissect the brain and slice tissue and stain it with chemicals, and then you put it under a microscope. And before photomicroscopy, you had to draw the slides. Like that was the only way to disseminate information. If you wanted to share, publish your findings, you had to be able to draw them. So his biography is really interesting, but he always wanted to be an artist. That's the important thing about this. So this is a painting that he did when he was about 12 years old. So he says that if he continued to want to be an artist, he would have kind of ended up as this forgotten romantic imitator. I mean, I think he's really talented, but as we'll see in a couple slides, his talents were best put to different use. Here's another one that he did. This is from his military service in Cuba. He was like 21. So he always was drawing, and he was always interested in creating art. When he started investigating the brain, what he found was that there is no continuous physical network. There's a continuous signaling process, but the material of the brain is actually discontinuous. The brain is composed of cells that are separated by infinitesimal spaces. This is really radical and beautiful to me. I think a lot about Rainer Maria Rilke is like another spirit animal, I guess, like in the pantheon of spirit animals. He talks a lot about, how each of us is unutterably alone, and what love is two solitudes bordering each other. I think about that a lot. What nerve cells, or what later called neurons, do is send out their processes towards each other, and they make contact, but they don't actually touch. What Cahal called this is contact by contiguity, not continuity. So they would establish a proximity, and there would be this little space that was later called the synapse. So I'm going to cycle through some of these drawings. This is a Purkinje cell. This is a very complex, large cell in the cerebellum, which is largely responsible for movement. All of his drawings are composites. They're not... there was a creative process through which he would look at different cells, essentialize them, and kind of derive general characteristics, and then create a representative portrait that still stood as a scientific finding. This is a bad image. These are neuroblasts. These are like really, really, really young cells, like when they're first growing. These are what's called dendritic spines. These are the processes that reach out and make contact with other cells. They have these little terminals that you see on the side. He called them spines because they thought they looked like rose thorns. He was a very naturalistic thinker, which I think is beautiful too. These are, I think, astrocytes. They look like crazy science fiction creatures to me. And I just thought, again, in thinking about our experience of reality, and then looking at the structure that underlies that reality, it just, there's an interesting symmetry there. Some more here. I love this one. There's like this great energy and sort of pathos to this one. This is a fiber that's breaking apart. This is trauma. Okay, so not until the 1950s was there technology enough to actually see this little space. Like, he theorized that communication between these distinct entities happened across an infinitesimal space and propagated a continuous signal. But he didn't actually see that, and we didn't see that until the 1950s with electron microscopes. So this is a synapse. These are two cells, the two blobs. And this little space in between is the two solitudes bordering on each other, the contiguity rather than the continuity. It's that space in between. So basically, I've been trying to write a book about this man and his discoveries for a really long time, and I've been struggling because there's so much information, and the material has this like crazy associative, proliferative quality to it, and I struggle with organization personally anyway, so it's like just kind of getting really out of control. But one day, recently, I was looking at a visual layout of one of my pages. This is just a draft, and I just blew it. But basically, I was looking at these paragraphs I was writing, and I thought, well, this kind of looks like basically, what is the book? It's like, is it a top-down continuous narrative that I have to fashion? That I was thinking about, he was born in 1852, and I was trying to fashion this historical fiction or non-fiction narrative from 1852. It's really hard. I can't even live 2 days in a row the same, and I don't know anything about what life was like then, and all the research is in Spanish and Catalan and stuff, so it's just really hard. But I thought, what if, I purposely left this space in between paragraphs, and I made paragraphs the distinctly individual basic units of my text. And I resisted the impulse to connect them in a physical, overt way, but I left them purposefully separate and asked the reader, basically when we read, you know, we use language to convey information, like if you read a menu or a street sign or an email, and a lot of academic writing is taught this way. You know, intro sentence, be clear so we know what we're going to get. Concluding sentence, like make sure you wrap it up, and then hold the reader's hand across this little white space so nobody gets scared. And that's not what happens in the brain. There's this moment of kind of openness and transfer, transmission. I wanted the reader to do that with their attention. But you know, reader's attention moves in one direction, just like the impulses in the brain. It's left to right, and then top to bottom throughout the book. So I thought, you know, just developing this idea further, if I chose an identity for each paragraph, like a place, time, style, metaphor, motif, something that defined that paragraph, and then stayed within that identity, but then juxtaposed like seemingly different or discontinuous elements, like the brain, could it possibly be that people would transmit their attention across the space? And then like what emergent patterns would come from that? So that's something I've been doing for like the last 4 weeks, and I'm going to just read a couple paragraphs to that effect. If it doesn't work, like let me know, because I kind of want to know if it works or not. So, like if you come up to me like, Ben, like you said this really great thing, it sounded cool, but you didn't do it, or you know, just let me know. So I'll leave this one up. Okay. So the book is called The Brain That Discovered Itself. Well, the book doesn't exist, but the book the book project is called The Brain That Discovers Itself, and this is the introduction. This exists. This is called the Texture of the Nervous System of Man and Vertebrates. A man sits alone in a small room. His head is bowed. His back is hunched over a wooden table. In a long blue robe, pleated in the front, he resembles both a monk and a musketeer. A soft cylindrical cap fails to tempt his patterned baldness. It is the middle of the night. Soft light glows from a filtered gas lamp. He is staring down a steel tube like the barrel of the gun, as straight as the bridge of his nose. Concentric shadows underscore his onyx eyes. The cloth on the table, once white, is now stained with various colors: rust brown, coal black, blood red. He lets out a grumbling exhalation. He is talking to himself. Some inaudible Spanish words. The sound of his voice is rich and deep. His only company is a crowd of squat glass bottles standing on a nearby shelf, labeled in his own disheveled script. Dr. Santiago Ramón y Cajal, Barcelona. Formaldehido, etanol, nitrato de plata, bicromato de potasio, embrión de pollo, 3 días. Glass vats, rubber tubes, razor blades, pens and pencils, and scraps of paper also serve as shadow witnesses. Any extra chair is occupied by book piles. Their authors always speak to him, but they never interrupt. He blinks quickly, shuttering the scene. Ink blot bodies, lightning shock filaments, suspended in a womb of sallow translucence. With his left hand, he turns the slide. With his right, he adjusts his focus. The material course of thought and will is unspooling itself before him. All his life, he has been pulling at this one invisible thread. Las Ramblas runs like a thick nerve through the center of the old city. The famous street is wearing a necklace of electric lights. Giant sycamores curve both sides of the gaping thoroughfare. The spokes of turning carriage wheels blur into illusory spheres. The Liceu Opera spits out a babbling mass after the world premiere of Carmen. Newborn railroad cars sleep quaintly in their stations. In their top hats and tailcoats, dots of people disperse through the warm spring night. Separatists meet in theaters, plotting the coup in Catalan. The socialists plan their congress, the anarchists huddle in bars. Antoni Gaudí is touching up the melted facade of the Palais Güell. Around the clock, working men slave as the city prepares for the Universal Exhibition of 1888. High atop a pedestal, the figure of Christopher Columbus, still encaged by scaffolding, points his bronze arm toward the sea. Midnight tides brush the Mediterranean shore. On the beach, whole families are crammed into single-room slums made out of recycled garbage. El Raval is a neighborhood of immigrants and tenements. The alleys below are twisted and narrow. Thick black smoke rises up from the factory stacks. The smell is of pungent coal. All throughout the continent of Europe, Barcelona becomes known for the mass production of textiles. The ancient Egyptians did not believe that you needed a brain for the afterlife. The heart was the home of the soul, so they thought, and the dead should be judged on its lightness alone. That is why, during the sacred ritual of mummification, embalmers would leave the heart inside the body, but the brain would be removed. The Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BCE provides the most detailed account of this process, now known as excerebration. They take first a crooked piece of iron, he reports, and with it draw the brain out through the nostrils, thus getting rid of a portion, while the skull is cleared of the rest by rinsing with drugs. Although the first recorded word for brain appears in a surgical papyrus, theirs was a gross misunderstanding. In fact, nothing happens without the brain. In his treatise on the sacred disease, Hippocrates, father of medicine, he of the eponymous oath, first articulates the implications of its role. Men ought to know, he writes, that from nothing else but the brain come joys, delights, laughter, and sports, sorrows, griefs, despondency, and lamentations. In other words, the brain produces what we know to be the mind, including all of its suffering. I'll stop there. Actually, I'm going to hand it off to Noah, who's going to talk about discontinuity in visual and cultural systems.